Queensland's Gulf country is as flat as it is spectacular. A lot of the country around here is taken up with cattle properties, but being remote doesn't mean you have to be by yourself. Many people in the outback have come to rely on HF radio.
Good morning, everybody. This is Cairns School of Distance Education, broadcasting on frequencies 5300, 5865 and 11015.
Good morning, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Good morning. Yes, Sophie?
I've got some exciting news for you today.
Oh, that sounds great. What's that, Sophie?
We've got a special guest in Bush Tuckerman, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Great, Sophie.
Yes, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Good morning, how are you, Ava?
Very well. Is that the real Les Higgins, the Bush Tucker man?
Crikey, I hope so, Ava. We're in strife if it's not.
That's great. What are you doing at Rutland Plains?
Well, I'm here at the moment following up the explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, and I find him quite a fascinating bloke because we came through this Rutland Plains area, 1845, round about then, and something rather... I've always wanted to follow Leichhardt's journey because he was so passionate about exploration. On this, his first trip, he took 7 men. Naturalist John Gilbert, Calvert, Murphy and Roper and Philp, and 2 Aboriginals, Brown and Charlie. Charlie was the real character of the expedition, and we catch up with him a bit later on. This amazing journey started in September 1844, when the expedition left Toowoomba in Queensland and then travelled all the way up Cape York, through the Gulf of Carpentaria and on to the British garrison at Port Essendon. The aim was to find a way to the north and to prove the viability of pastoral land for the future. I'm starting this trip here at Rutland Plains because this cattle property on Cape York has a special place in the history of Leichhardt. Up to now, the many Aboriginals they came across were more curious than threatening. However, all that was about to change. What happened next created a whole turning point for the expedition. For some reason or other, and we're not really quite sure about the whole thing, the Aboriginals decided to put in an attack around about 7 o'clock at night. They ended up spearing Roper and Calvert, and they killed Gilbert. Poor old Calvert, he copped a spear through the groin. Stopped him riding a horse for a while, I can tell you. The next day they buried Gilbert, and feeling that they might be attacked again, they decided to move on. Many of the rivers round here already had names, but not all of them, and Leichhardt was pretty keen to fill in the gaps. So the next major river he came across, guess what he called it? There have been some pretty strange things that have happened around this Gulf country, and this train line is one of them. It was built for the gold rush era in the 1880s, and it's only 150 kilometres long. It was supposed to link up with the rest of the Queensland Railway, but it never happened. These days it's mainly used by tourists. Leichhardt had come out from Prussia a few years earlier and immediately set out on short trips to learn as much as he could about the Australian bush. It was his enthusiasm and his new skills as a bushman that would eventually get him through. They'd all been on the road now for 10 months and were starting to feel the effects of what had been a difficult journey.
Of course, the longer Leichhardt's expedition went on, the fewer rations and provisions he had. By the time he got round this Gulf country here, he'd run out of salt. It was a great one for scrounging round the countryside, Leichhardt. And round here, he resupplied himself. Apparently he was looking for salt, but some of the men weren't real keen on it. When he bunged it in the stew that night, some of them went crook at him because they reckon he put in too much salt. Anyway, that's it.
It was Brown and Charlie's job to find food and to act as guides, but Charlie was a bit cheeky quite often, which caused Leichhardt to sack him one time, only to reinstate him the next day, of course.
You know, one of the great interesting things about this Leichhardt expedition is the fact that it was privately funded, not like a lot of the other exploration that was going on at the time. See, people like Major Mitchell and Captain Charles Sturt and Kennedy and those types, they all had government funding backing them. Poor old Leichhardt, he had to crank up the funding himself, so he got a whole bunch of patrons and sponsors. They tipped in money hoping that he might find something. I guess they were interested in grazing country and that sort of thing. And as he went round the place, he named different places after those sponsors and patrons. And you see this creek here, which turns into a river a little bit down the stream there a bit further. This is called Robinson River, and it's named after the bloke Robinson in Moreton Bay, who helped him kit out the expedition in the first place. One of my favourite little rivers, this one.
By the time he'd moved around the bottom of the Gulf, he was way behind schedule, and his men were grumbling and wondering if they'd ever get to Port Essendon. He was now heading northwest, where I'm going, to an area that's surrounded by beautiful lagoons. Whenever I'm going to stop for a few days, I like to build a decent camp, which is both simple and comfortable. It's not a bad idea to have something to do two jobs. These wooden planks here hold my jerry cans together in the trailer, but they've got another use, making life in the bush just that bit better.
Setting up camp, a lot of hard work at times, but it's really worth it if you're going to stay somewhere for a number of days. This lagoon here is right beside the Roper River. I'm going to have a look around here, because right here, we're right slap bang in the middle of Leichhardt country. There's a few things around here I want to have a look at over the next few days.
Leichhardt was said to be a bit of an oddball, but he really was very practical, and his camps were always well organised. He'd occasionally stay for a few days in one spot, so that he could kill a bullock and dry the meat to preserve it. He made sure he wasted nothing. He even collected the fat using it to grease the saddles and the harness.
Old habits die hard. When Leichhardt came through this country here, he encountered lots and lots of Aboriginal people. And on one occasion, he actually got talking to them. Well, sort of talking anyway. And he gave them a bit of a present. Some of his spare horseshoe nails. But they came back at him and they said, hey, we don't want them like this. We want them bent so we can make fish hooks out of them. Obviously, those people had somewhere or somehow encountered steel before, so they knew what it could be made into. All this country around here is so rich in game and bird life and all the rest of it. It supported quite a lot of Aboriginal people back in those days. And if you look very, very carefully, you can still see signs of that era. Oi, come and have a look at this. I've seen a lot of rock etchings in my time, but I've never seen anything like this. Look at this, these feet are absolutely superb. And there's lots and lots of them around all these rocks here. You can see that they've been chipped into the rock, and somehow the winds move the sand across and it's all collected there and they really jump out at you. Come on, I'll show you something else.
Called petroglyphs, these engravings preserve Aboriginal art. You see, these rocks are in a riverbed, and during the wet, they're covered by a mass of water, which would normally wash away painted surfaces.
Back to Mr. Leichhardt. By the time he crossed this river here behind me, they were trying out all sorts of bush tucker, including this stuff here, which is a resin out of the tree. Take it back to camp and boil it up and chew it. I've tried it before, it's a bit like eating glue. I think it'll save me appetite for something better. I might try and catch a few yabbies, knock up a bit of a yabby pot here. This place here used to be a cattle property, so you can find all sorts of junk lying around the place. I found this old flour drum up the way there. Back in Leichhardt's day, of course, they didn't have drums of flour, they had bags of flour. And he lost about 60 pounds of it by the time he got here. So he's running short on flour as well as everything else. Banged a few holes in it with the back of the pick. Should work like a beauty. Lump of meat on a bit of wire, which is what the yabbies want. See how it goes.
Leichhardt was a great observer. Looking through the Aboriginal camps, he soon figured out just what plants you could eat. However, the job of catching birds and animals was mostly up to the Aboriginal guides, Brown and Charlie.
One day Charlie came down to one of these billabongs here at the Roper, looking for ducks or flying foxes, I forget which, doesn't matter. He looked in the billabong, he saw this monster, this animal, this strange looking thing come out of the water with horns on it and all sorts of things. I reckon there was no way he was going to get in that water. He went back to camp and told Leichhardt and the whole rest of them. They sort of didn't take much notice of it. In fact, next day, Brown went up to the same waterhole and he saw a crocodile. So, in his journal, Leichhardt tends to dismiss Charlie's monster as being a crocodile with Charlie added horns to it. Well, there are crocodiles in here. Well, I guess it's just as well if Charlie didn't get in the water because it might have been goodbye Charlie. But I'm not so sure about this monster business. I think Charlie saw what Charlie saw. We might be able to figure it out.
This is the mighty Roper River, named by Leichhardt after one of his men, John Roper. The river was to be the expedition's next big challenge.
Poor old Leichhardt had a real dilemma. He had to somehow find himself on the northern bank of the Roper River, but it's a pretty mighty river. How do you cross it? Well, the only thing he could do, and that's exactly what he did do, was move along the southern bank, trying to look for a way to get across. And then he got to this creek here, and they had an absolute disaster here. Charlie moved the horses into the creek, and 3 of them drowned. Leichhardt was absolutely devastated, but there's nothing much he could do. So they kept on moving on down that way. I'll tell you one thing that wasn't here when he came through. That's this stuff here. That's a bush passion fruit, introduced from South America. And these days, it's a real pest. It's spread everywhere. That's the Roper River Bar crossing. And this location to Leichhardt is both good and bad. It was bad in so much as just back there a little bit, he lost yet again another horse. Slipped in off the steep bank and drowned. I guess the men and the beasts and the horses and everything were all coming to the end of their tether. They're just too weak. But he got up here and he saw exactly what he was looking for. A rocky bar stretching all the way across to the northern bank there. And that let him walk all the way across there, get on that northern shore and start heading up to Port Essendon. I guess in many ways it's not a bad thing he did find the bar, because this water, even though it looks inviting, is absolutely full of crocodiles. Oh, I got some. Have a go at that. These things, when you cook them up, just exactly the same as prawns. Terrific eating, these things. Had a thought the other day. This is probably the first time that salt from the Gulf country has been carted over here to the Roper River since Leichhardt did it way back then.
They'd now been travelling for 13 months, and they're still a long way short of their goal. Leichhardt only had a few bullocks left as he got closer and closer to Port Essendon. Leichhardt had maps with him that had been surveyed from the coast, which is pretty much all they showed. So as he went along, he filled in some of the details. Today, there's one map around here that's got a really weird name.
This one here, if you have a look at it, it's called Snowdrop, which is rather a strange name for any map in the middle of a Northern Territory. And down here, we've got a Snowdrop Creek. Leichhardt actually walked right through this stuff here. But how come we've got a name like Snowdrop for a map in the Northern Territory? For years that puzzled me. A few years back I happened to read Leichhardt's journal. I found the answer. Remember though that Leichhardt, when he left Toowoomba, started off with something like 16 bullocks to eat along the way. And by the time he got here, he was down to 3. And he killed one of them. Killed them in that creek there, that Snowdrop Creek. The bullock's name was Snowdrop because he had a little white dot on the front of his forehead here. So I guess Snowdrop got not only a map named after him, but also a creek.
This rocky plateau became the next obstacle. As spectacular as it looks, Leichhardt described the view as sickening. complaining of large loose boulders that cause the animals to slip. Nowadays it's called Kakadu, a national park on the World Heritage List, and it's more than likely that Leichhardt was probably the first European visitor. Today it's a breeding ground for something like 1/3 of Australia's known species of bird life. Arnhem Land has been home to Aboriginal people for thousands of years, and a record of that time can be found in the caves around here.
Oh yeah, they're both there.
These decorated hands may have originated from gloves worn by the British or even the Dutch visiting Australia's north.
What do you reckon that is, English or Macusson boat? Macusson. By the time Leichhardt got to this neck of the world, and it's a tremendous bit of country here, he started to encounter Aboriginal people who'd obviously met Europeans and Macusson traders and those sort of people around the coastline before. That became very obvious when one of them came up to him and called him Commandant. But also you get rock art galleries like this that reflect that connection. Well, from here, Leichhardt had to find his way right up there to Port Essendon, weave his way through all these billabongs down here. I won't have the same trouble he did. I won't need the Aboriginal guides, but I better get going if I'm going to get there.
They'd now been travelling for around 15 months, presumed to be lost. As they moved further north, friendly Aboriginals guided the exhausted party towards the garrison and Victoria settlement. Today, the best way to get there is by boat, or one of these. I've been out here a few times, and it never ceases to amaze me. A more lonely place in Australia is hard to imagine, as the site for this settlement was on a strip of land thousands of kilometres away from the rest of the colony. Built in 1838, Victoria Settlement was established to be a support base for British ships travelling to and from New South Wales. However, after 11 years and enormous hardship, the British government decided to chuck it in. Disease and poor nutrition had claimed the lives of 60 people, men, women and children. Mid-December 1845, Leichhardt and his men staggered into Victoria Settlement. The lost explorers were enthusiastically greeted and supplied with much-needed provisions and clothing.
This settlement here is only one of a number that the British tried up here in northern Australia. Had another go at one over there earlier on, over there at Fort Dundas and Melville Island and Raffles Bay over that way, and then finally this one here. And one by one they all failed. I suspect that Charlie's Monster originated from here, because what happened was those three settlements stocked themselves with water buffalo, and as the settlements collapsed, the buffalo were let run loose and that sort of thing, and gradually they spread all the way down through this top end country right down to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and that had been going on for something like 20 years before Leichhardt even came up here, so the spread was all over the place. And what Charlie saw down there in that lagoon down on the Roper River was in fact a water buffalo standing in the water up to here, therefore he couldn't see any legs or anything, but he's got this great big head, his back out of the water, and like he said, two big horns. Well, that's my theory anyway.
Leichhardt stayed here for a month before catching a ship back to Sydney. They'd covered an incredible 5,000 kilometres of unexplored country with the loss of only one life. However, 2 years later, he set off again to cross Australia and mysteriously disappeared.
You know, you really have to be impressed by this whole Leichhardt expedition. They start way down there in the Darling Downs, and over a year later, literally stagger into Port Essendon here up in the top end country. Along the way, Leichhardt, of course, named rivers and streams and mountains and etc. after his patrons and those people that were on the expedition. Even Charlie and Brown get a mention. Brown's Lagoon's down in southeast Queensland, and Charlie gets a creek named after him in central Queensland. But to my mind, Charlie's the real hero, the real character in this whole event, because he's the one, along with Brown's help, who each day carts in all the food and the flying foxes and the ducks, etc. And I reckon without the input from those two, the expedition would not have succeeded. I somehow feel that Charlie's been shortchanged a bit over the years. Didn't quite get the recognition he deserves. Well, maybe there's something we can really do about that.